This is the first class in a three-class series on how to use the drawing tools in Mach 3 to draw your own patterns. Today we're going to focus on just sort of an overall review of the different tools that you have available and some basic shapes and how to use those pretty effectively on your quilts. And then the second class next week we're going to do piano keys, butt-to-beak patterns and pattern or point-to-point patterns. And then in week 3 we will create blocks, work on over a photo or a drawing, use Dresden or create Dresden blades and arrays, and then also do some trimmables and fills. So you'll get a full review of all the different possibilities this program offers. In Mach 3, we'll go ahead and open the draw menu, and I'll just kind of go down through these tools. A couple different ways that you can draw. If you want, you can leave it checked for mouse and say begin drawing, and then just touch your screen, and you can draw just with your finger on the screen or with a stylus. So this is really direct, and it's easy to keep kind of smooth lines and edit them later on. So I'm going to go ahead and say accept that, and if I click on it, you can see that there are not too many nodes, unlike some of the other tools, but you definitely can come in and edit and smooth things out if you want, and we'll go over that through the course of this. So another way that you can draw is, let me go ahead and delete this. You can come down here and use the choices down here. So a line, if I say begin and I still have the mouse selected, I can click and it's going to place a straight line between my clicks. So if you're working with straight lines, that's a great way to go. An arc, if I click, it places the first part of the arc, say begin, first part of the arc, the end of the arc, and the third click is my peak. And then it continues on so I can place the next couple of clicks. So you can just continue drawing with this. This is the tool that I use the most. The spline tool is a little bit harder to use. It's harder to control, so I don't tend to use it very often, but you can click and it sort of will compute a curve between your clicks. And so if you're trying to trace something, that's really sort of hard to master. What I do want to show you with all of these, though, is that if we go back and click on them, you can see how few nodes there are in this, so it makes it really easy to edit these nodes. On the arc, same thing. There's the nodes that I can move around, and then I can mess with the curve by clicking on this small circle. In the spine, there's fewer nodes than there were when we used the top draw menu, the one with the actual screen. And so this is a little bit easier to edit, and these are called handles, and you can kind of move them around to change the design. And so, you know, if you get close with it the first pass, then you can come back in and edit. So you'll just kind of figure out which tool works for you, which one's most comfortable. But I definitely tend to use the arc. I can even, with the arc, let's see, I'll say begin again, draw a straight line. So if I click the first and last points and then just right back in the middle of it, it will give me a straight line. So I can combine that with curves if I want to. So to me, it's just the most flexible tool. So as a reminder, you've got your help menu up here. If you click on this question mark, there is content that you can read through that describes some of these tools. Just to kind of finish out this section, the top draw area, you can draw with the sew head. I've found that this doesn't work very well. Your machine does take stitches, and so you can play around with it, but I haven't really been able to master it. I think it's something that could use a little bit more work by Innova before it's a very useful option for us. If you do check continuous sew, then your start and end are going to automatically connect, and that's the best choice to use if you're going to try to create a drawing that you might want to use as a mask later on. We talked last week extensively about the text and font options, and so I invite you to go back and take a look at that video if you want to learn more about text and doing continuous line words. So we're going to probably focus most of our time today in this area. And so we'll go ahead and start doing some basic shapes and learning how to add to your pattern library. So let's start with a really basic pattern, just a kind of an upside down V that we can use to test out some of these different things. So a pattern that is going to be repeatable has to follow a couple basic rules, and generally it has to start on the left, end on the right, and the start and end have to be on the same horizontal plane. And so to do that, I'm going to go to the Settings tab, and I'm going to check the Snap to Grid option so it's on. And we're going to start drawing just a real basic shape here. I'm going to go with line. So I'll start over here on the left, say begin, put a click on, I've got the Snap to Grid off, so it's going to actually snap to that point. Come up here, a couple, half the distance of the width of my pattern, snap on that or click on that, and then come down here, and I have my first pattern. I right click to deselect that tool or say done. And so now we can start messing around with this pattern. But what I want you to try to start doing right off the bat is you could use this even for like an auto fit pattern right now, but go ahead and save it so you have access to it in a later project. And to do that, I'll go ahead and select it. I think it's selected in the draw menu, but I'll go ahead and select it in the transform tool. Go to file, and there's a couple different options. I can save the pattern here, and it gives me a choice to name it and do some comments about it, but I don't find that it's very easy to add tags to it. And so even though this is going to take a couple extra steps, what I recommend you do is go to File and then Export Selection. And that's going to go to default file path that's on the C drive under Program Files ×86, ABM Software, Autopilot, Data, and Patterns. And so it'll bring you in here, and let's go ahead and add a new folder of my pattern designs, and we'll put them in that just so they're in one spot. So I'll double click there, and let's call this, it does qualify as a point-to-point pattern, so you might call it P2P, chevron. We'll call it a chevron. So you can save that. Now if I go to File, Import Pattern, I can navigate to that same spot. So Program Files, ABM Software, Autopilot, Data, Patterns, and actually go into that file, and you'll see it right here. So I can double click on it to import it, and now I can apply whatever tags I want. So for the moment I'll just say jukebox, and maybe if I can find point to point quickly, I'll check that too because it does qualify. So I'll say import. Now it's in your pattern library and you can use it. Go down here to jukebox, search by tag, and it's right here. So if I double click, it's on my pattern pad. It takes a couple extra steps, but it's worth it because you won't lose track of that pattern later on. So let's play with this pattern now. I'll go ahead and drag it on from my pattern pad, and we can show you some of the things that can be done with this. The first thing I want to do though is go back in and take that snap to grid off. Did you see how it was kind of magnetically snapping to certain things? So now I can move it without that restriction. Let's set this up a couple different ways. Let's just experiment with this pattern in the edge to edge tool, and let's go ahead, I'll leave it on trim and just say generate. So I'm going to get a nice zigzag pattern that goes across the quilt. So super easy. There's your first pattern. You can use it. And the nice thing about the Innova is it's going to start on this side, go this direction, then come down and go this direction. So it's going to sew very efficiently. We don't have to reverse the sew path to get it to do that. And you could go ahead and use join if you wanted to connect 3 or 4, however many would fit in your sew zone. But you can start kind of playing around with this. Let's do a negative row gap, and you can make these very close. Go ahead and open that back up a little bit, and let's try an offset. So if you start playing with every other row and then do a negative, you get a whole different look to the pattern. So that's sort of a herringbone or a brick, kind of a laid brick pattern like you would see on a patio. So experiment with the different settings in edge to edge to see how versatile some of these basic patterns can be in terms of giving you some really cool textures that you can work with in your quilt. So I'll go ahead and say accept on that. So using the same pattern, let's go to edge again. I find that if I use the trim function, that it will recompute the edges, so I don't really have to mess with anything. If you use fit before you start kind of altering things, then you might have to do some editing to get your edges to look right. So I leave it on trim. So let's go ahead and generate this again. And I'm going to do a 50% offset and say update. And I actually can get the look of a crosshatch over the entire quilt. As you're sewing this, you might want to stitch out a row or two and then put push pins on the quilt, on the actual stitching, to make any adjustments that you might need to make to allow for shrinkage. But this is a way to get a large grid across the entire quilt. Okay, back to that same pattern, just set up using the trim function in edge to edge. Let's mess now with the offset again, and I'll go ahead and update. So we're back to our grid, but now play with the row gap, and you can overlap these and get a whole nother look. So even down to a tighter grid, kind of like this one. There's literally endless possibilities with this. Let's go ahead, I'm going to enlarge it here using the transform tool, and I'm going to go to edge, not use the edge to edge function down here, but rather just create more repeats and create it much larger than the space, and I'll say generate. Or I guess I'll just get out of that. So you can use copy and paste to create some neat things that you can ultimately end up using as fills as well. So I'll copy this, and I'm going to pull it down and offset it a little bit. Then I might take both of those, copy both of them, pull that down, sort of position it in the same. Let's go back this way so I don't have any gaps on the edges. And so repeat that just to get really interesting textures. And I could put those inside of a mask if I wanted to get a really unique look on it. And it's going to sew one direction, and then actually, because I copied and pasted it, what I should have done is reversed. I'll do reverse sew here. And I should have done that before I copied and pasted, so it would go over here and then come back rather than have to come back to the side to always start on the left here. So just do that before you start replicating them to get all kinds of other secondary patterns. All right, let's do the same thing with the arc to just sort of experiment with some of the patterns that we can get from a basic arc shape. So again, I'm going to go to settings and snap to grid on and choose my arc tool and zoom in here and say begin, and I'll click on one side halfway or straight across to the end. Remember, the third click is actually your peak. So that's my peak. And I'll go ahead and go through the same process of exporting that as a pattern to bring it back into my pattern pad so I can use it on future projects. So we'll do some experimenting with this arc. I'll go ahead and pull it on and make it a little bit larger. And I did take the snap to grid off, so I can work with this in some repeat pattern options. So let's go to the edge to edge function, and I'll leave it on trim and say generate edge to edge. So you'll get that kind of design. You can mess around with the row gap to get some interesting other designs. Let's see if I can get back to it here. Get back to trim, generate again, and let's say 50% offset on the columns. So I'll update that so you get a really great clamshell pattern. And we'll revisit this with some other clamshell stuff in one of the third video. So let's go back to this and play with both of them just incrementally. So let's say a partial offset like that, and then let's mess with the row gap options and kind of see what kind of secondary patterns we get, and then play around maybe with flipping some of the rows. So let's say horizontal and update. That flipped them all. Let's do alternating ones. So that might be kind of fun to go ahead and continue altering and making things closer together. So you can see these just provide endless opportunities to come up with different ideas. I'm going to take that down even a little bit further just to kind of see what happens. You get those petals. That's kind of cool. Here's some more just playing around with the different options that you have in the program. So if I have this selected and I say more, I can get a, what is it called? Orange peel effect by, I'll go ahead and copy it, and then I will mirror it, and you can place it over, kind of get them both centered like that. And in this situation, you might want to choose one of them and reverse sew it. So it will start over here and then come back. And then by copying and pasting that and offsetting it a little bit, you get this other really kind of cool texture. So just, I invite you to play around with it and just see all the different possibilities that you can come up with to build your pattern library and choices up. So give it a shot. I've brought our basic chevron back in, and you can do some fun things just by editing these 3 digital points. So I'm going to go back to our draw menu and maybe just move the peak a little bit and then mess around with it in your edge-to-edge icon, and by playing around with the offsets and experimenting, you can get completely different looks with it once again. So go ahead and explore that. So I'll go ahead and cancel that. And you can also come in to the draw menu and add more points. As long as your start and end are on the same horizontal line, you can do anything you want in the middle. So let me say add points, and maybe I'll click one here and one here, and then uncheck that to get out of that tool. And then you can come in and mess around with your points and experiment with that as a pattern. I have no idea how this is going to work, but we'll give it a shot. So let's generate and see. Oop. I have to select that. Generate an edge to edge. Ooh, that's kind of neat. Let's offset it a little bit. And do a negative spacing just to sort of experiment, even overlap it. So you can get just incredible different patterns that will be completely unique to you. Okay, another super basic shape. I have checked my Snap to Grid and have it on. So this is one that you'll use all the time. I'm going to select Arc and Begin. And I'm going to come in here, and remember with the arc, you click your first and your last point, and the third click determines the arc, the peak of the arc. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to double back and come down and do this part of it, and then I'm going to go back to this point and double over here. So that just gave me a pattern that will start here, come all the way around, overlap, and end here. And when I do purls like this, I do a second one. So, but this time I'm going to start going down, come back, go up, and then I'm going to double over by selecting the lower part of it and right click to end. And so this will stitch out where the doubled over part will alternate, so it's not so visible when you use it. So I'll go ahead and save that as a pattern, and then I'll come back and set that up a couple different ways. Okay, I brought my pearls back in. You could definitely use those in a border if you wanted. I'll just say, have it selected there and go to edge to put it, you know, in a sashing or anything else. Or let's go ahead and delete that, bring them back on, and play around with it as an overall pattern. So I'm going to say fit because, or trim, because I don't want them to distort. If you pick fit, they might stretch a little bit. So I'll say generate edge to edge. So we have our circles there, but then start playing around with the placement. Let's take it all the way to a halfway point maybe, and then decrease the row gap so that nuzzles in like a pile of oranges, or you can continue to decrease that to get some really neat orange peel designs on that. So lots of different options with that particular pattern. And it's going to sew very efficiently going one direction and then back. Going back to the draw menu and checking my Snap to Grid on, let's do a 2-direction curve that you'll use all the time. So I'm going to zoom way in here and come down to Arc and say Begin. And let me do the first and the last point, and the upper part of the curve, and then travel on to this one and do the lower part of the curve. And this becomes a really handy pattern that you can use. So I'll save that and then come back and show you how to set that up in some different ways. All right, our two-pointed arc, let's experiment with that in the edge-to-edge function. So I'll say generate edge-to-edge, and you could decrease the row gap, get it really dense in there, maybe start messing with the offset to experiment with some things in there. Let's do almost a 50%. Control Z just to kind of get back. And how about we go all the way back to the first generation one, and let's flip every other row. So that's kind of cool. Again, playing with the row gap, getting some different effects with that, and adding some offset. You get some really interesting patterns going to use as fills, or, ooh, I like that. Whatever you want to do with them. I'm going to say accept. I really think that's pretty cool. Let's draw one more pattern. So go to my draw menu. I've got my grid snap on, and I'm going to do the cross arms on a star. So I'll do those two, come down here to the opposite corner, my peak, go back there. I'll go back to the beginning, but then I'm going to cross straight over so the start and end are on the same horizontal line. So I will go ahead and experiment with that a little bit in some different edge-to-edge options. I'll save it in a second, but let's just try to see how that's going to look. Do a negative row gap. Interesting. So what I think I would prefer on this one is just for a border. So let's say more. So that would be kind of fun on a patriotic quilt. And you could definitely go in and alter the points and change the shape if you don't like that before you save that as a pattern. Once I have that star kind of roughed in where the start and end are on the same horizontal line, I can take my snap to grid and turn it off, and then go back in and alter these so I can get a shape that I like maybe a little bit better, a little more uniform. Let's bring those up all the way to this point. And so then I can select that and export it as a pattern. I'd like to invite you to watch my AutoFit class that we did earlier that's available on the YouTube channel before we start doing some patterns next week, because I'll show you how to design them, but not so much how to use them. So it'll make sense if you go back and watch that. So we'll see you next week with some more complicated patterns that are going to help build to your library. Thanks.